Hello, everybody.
Hi,
This is Michael Molina and Linda Molina.
at your service.
This is our first episode of the Kundalini Connection.
Thanks for joining us.
So, Linda, just a little bit about the show and maybe about ourselves first.
Okay,
Why don't we go ahead and introduce ourselves?
go ahead.
All right. So, we have been married for around a decade now,
Yeah.
11 years. And during that time, we've been very much involved in Kundalini investigation, and everything about what we do in terms of our work for the world involves Kundalini. So we are co-founders of the Emerging Sciences Foundation. I'm also the creator of Brilliano, which is a tool that is designed to study Kundalini on a large scale.
Yeah.
And during that time, we've had a lot of different interactions with people who have awakened Kundalini. I would consider both of us to be awakened individuals. We both have had our own Kundalini experiences in our own right, although very, very different types of experiences. And so,
Yeah, I just want to go back to, when we first met, we met because I thought politics was a way to change the world. I grew up in a lower socioeconomic environment, and I saw a lot of suffering. And I was fueled by the understanding that it was unnecessary. And as I got older, went to college, I joined, they called it the Long Beach City Campus Progressives. And Michael there was a liaison from Cal State Long Beach, and they called him Kundalini Mike. And I had heard of Kundalini, but didn't know what it was. So I flagged him down one day and I asked him. And the rest is history. I mean, we got married. It took me a while to understand Kundalini because I swore that it was politics, the way to change the world. But with time and with many, many discussions, I came to understand it. And that's why we are here today, to hopefully bring people who don't really understand why we integrate certain things together with Kundalini, who tend to separate, the spiritual aspect and politics, but those things are actually very much intertwined.
yeah, so Linda's right. I mean, this is an important conversation we're having today about Kundalini and politics. And on the surface, it might not be immediately apparent to people as to why they're even connected or why they should even belong in the same sentence together. We've written a number of blog posts in the past, and one in particular from June of 2016, where we got politics involved in Kundalini and intertwined the two subjects.
We just threw it in there randomly.
Yeah, so I'm going to just, I wouldn't normally quote things at length, but it's important, I think, to just provide context for this conversation,
It's
right?
a good one, yeah.
So in the article, it mentions that one of the most important changes that occurs as a result of Kundalini is the transformation of personality. Research suggests that that a person with a properly functioning Kundalini generally has a lack of greed and materialism, is more loving, and is more sensitive to the well-being of the world and those around them. If we take a look at history and examine all of the civilizations that fell, we find inequality and immorality as a common thread. This happens when we live against the laws of the Kundalini mechanism regulating the brain, which demand a more moral personality in order to evolve properly. The myths and religions of the world exist today even after thousands of years because of these laws. A very simple modern-day example of how we can see society living against these laws is Donald Trump and his influence on so many people. When the cells of our body are no longer serving the greater whole in a healthy way, they often destroy themselves through a process called programmed cell death, or apoptosis. It's clear that if Trump becomes the next president, a nuclear war is closer than we think. So this article was written back in 2016 and was part of the article itself was about our experience with an indigenous community where we got to experience a very special ceremony, but also saw that there was a very clear incontrovertible connection between the mythology of the Mesoamerican cultures and also of Indian culture. And so we made the connection between the two, which is apparent in the article. But one of the things that happened was people read this article, and not everybody, but there was a couple individuals who really took issue with the fact that we would call out Donald Trump in our article,
and not Hillary,
and specifically not Hillary Clinton. So today is our opportunity to speak directly to those individuals and everybody else who might take issue at this and explain the connection between Kundalini and politics. So I'll just start by saying, the very first thing is that, again, the connection between Kundalini and politics, most people are not completely aware of that connection.
I wasn't.
And so, how long did it take you to make that connection?
Don't make me say it. About 5 years.
Okay, so if you're wondering about the connection and it's not immediately apparent, our hope today is to help accelerate that process so it doesn't take 5 years.
Right.
Hopefully you can understand at least a little bit and get closer to that understanding today. So one of the first things that's important to mention is the perspective of Gopi Krishna, who was an early Kundalini researcher in the past 100 years or so, probably the foremost expert on Kundalini and Kundalini research, if you read his books.
We dig him big time.
And one of the things that he mentions in the books is that there is a connection between Kundalini and evolution on a global scale. So how can this be? Well, Kundalini, as we see it, is the mechanism that's responsible for the evolution of the brain. It's an intelligent energy. It's an energy that transcends time and space, and that is responsible for all of the functionings of our body and evolution in terms of our brain, right? Brain evolution. And if we extend that out now to look at the planet as a whole, then Kundalini is also the guardian of human evolution on a global scale. And so now what's the connection between Kundalini and politics? Well, if you assume that there is this intelligence that is operating on the brain, and you look at the civilizations that have risen and fallen over the entire lifespan of human civilization, it's pretty clear that this mechanism would also be imminent and extremely relevant to any conversation when it comes to politics. For example, as the human brain evolves and achieves higher and higher states of awareness, there is a certain path along which human beings are meant to evolve. And if you imagine all these civilizations now, and a certain civilization now beginning to live in a way that is antithetical, or that is in opposition to the Kundalini mechanism, now you have a situation where this mechanism is going to take action to correct the course of civilization. Now you can see this in many different forms, but it usually will come in the form of the collapse or the erosion of a society.
Especially when they start building walls.
Well, that's part of it. I mean, if you just look historically, right, there's many cases where a society will wall itself in, it'll become very protectionist, and then will essentially destroy itself from the inside out. You can look at the Roman Empire as a glaring example of that. And so it's important to understand this connection because it really drives to the point of what is the ideal society in which we are to live that is healthiest for our brain evolution.
So then it implies that this process has laws?
Correct. So there would be, in this process, right, as we go through our evolutionary trajectory, something that we would call the path, or something that Christ, Buddha, and others have called the path, the way, the road that leads to higher consciousness, or the liberation of the mind. And a deviation from that path or law would be something where this would incite this energy now to come into operation to correct us.
It's kind of like we've observed cause and effect, or just like something bad happening because you're not a consequence. That's the word I was looking for.
Okay, so a consequence, right? And so, I mean, that's the way that we look at this, right? The politics and the way that politics operates. If you look at, Adolf Hitler or other leaders in the past that were immoral, you look at the Roman Caesars and their degeneration over time, there is a correlation between the morality of a society and its eventual downfall. So overindulgence in sex, the breakup in familial structures, the protectionism, all these things are common features. Greed, and the consolidation of wealth into the hands of a few. These are all signs that a society is on the brink of collapse.
Now, that's not to say, too, that the reason why we didn't mention Hillary is because we don't think that she falls under that same light. I mean, she definitely does. We weren't either trying to support Hillary when we wrote this. We just didn't want to get into like a big old description of what we're trying to say. We just went with the what do they call it? Like the not the lesser of the two of the evils, but like the most.
Well, I think again, and when we wrote the article, we didn't want to get into the issue. But if we look at Hillary and Trump, they are both products of a system that is designed for a certain purpose, right?
Right.
It's designed to maintain the current status quo. It's
They're
designed.
Just puppets.
It's designed, but economically, politically, and everything. And but Trump was his win was a very interesting situation because you had all these forces acting, including potential interference from the outside, and all of this resulting in his win. On the same side, Hillary is no angel either, and we didn't mention her in the article, not because we believe that Hillary should win, right? But simply just to make a point. And so I'm not a proponent of either. Was not a proponent of either candidate. But I think it's important to call out I think the most important connection here between the Trump win and Kundalini, which is the fact that even leading up to the election, there were a lot of signs that Trump was not a moral individual. Whether you're talking about his business dealings or tape recordings made of him or anything like this, I think that the point people miss, and this I'm specifically talking to those who commented on our blog post, the point that is missed entirely is that you have on one hand a candidate who is overtly immoral, and that is coming to light more and more. It was obvious then, it's becoming more obvious now, but people have trouble changing their minds, which is something we'll talk about in a minute. And then on the other side, you have Hillary Clinton, who, if you really look at it, is also, let's say, an immoral person, but not as overtly immoral as Trump. And this is a really important distinction for people to make, because when you are overtly immoral, especially in a position of leadership, you are going to drag the entire ship down with you as you progress in your doing what you do as an immoral individual. And so the point that people miss is that this is one of the sure signs of a eroding civilization, is that you have immoral individuals come into power. Now, some people justified it and said, well, he's going to try to reform things. He's an outsider. He's not, a political insider like Hillary. But you have to look at it from the perspective of their moral position, right, on things, and how overtly moral and how they're going to come across to the common person. An educated, let's say someone who's very well educated on politics. I don't claim to be someone like that, but someone who's very well educated on politics, to them, that might not be so much of an issue. They may say, well, let's just, give him a shot and let him do his thing. But if you look at society on the whole, people tend to be dragged down by folks who are immoral in terms of their approach and outlook. And you saw that happening in the first few months and even longer after he was elected with, right-wing extreme, white supremacist groups coming out in full force, showing all of their colors and things like this. And it's only been progressing from there here in the US.
I just kind of want to also state that maybe it wasn't so bad, because if we had gone with Hillary, and everything would have been at a same level of just corruption, and everyone would have been okay. But now with Trump and everything coming out, because all has to come to light, everything does, that maybe this is just a process for us to have more people now become aware of what kind of structure we have, what kind of system we have, and is it really working for us?
This is one thing that's important when we talk about Kundalini from a political or a global context, which is that what's really important isn't necessarily the policies or the individuals in government. What's most important from a long-term evolutionary perspective is how well our systems of government, how well our society conforms to the laws of Kundalini, the laws of the brain, and the laws of evolution. That's really the factor that's going to decide our long-term health, not our position on immigration or economics or anything like that. All those things are really important. What's really important is how well those laws conform to the evolution of the brain. Because ultimately, if we are not living in ways that are consistent with those laws, our society is going to collapse, and it's going to collapse hard. And in the presence of nuclear weapons, with those devices now proliferated around the world in the hands of superpowers, you don't want to get into a situation where there's even the possibility of a global collapse, because the consequences could be pretty dire.
Though we do gotta hand it to Trump for meeting with Kim Jong-un, and so we might want to change our article.
Well, I mean, thing that we have yet to see, right? I mean,
right.
It sounded like they were making progress, and then it turns out that the little guy in Korea is still making his missiles, making his rockets, and now they want to talk again. So it's still yet to be seen, but it's not really what we can, it's really what we can't foresee, right? Happening in this situation. If there's a fallout, or if there's some conflict that arises in the Middle East, and Russia and China come together and now bring North Korea under their fold and allow them to be the rogue nation. But to your point, definitely his meeting with Kim Jong-un is a positive step. It's a step in the right direction. And so again, we got to see both sides, right? We got to look at both the good and the bad when we look at these political situations. But one thing that I did want to touch on, there's a lot of research out there around why people think the way that they do, why they believe the way that they do, and why it's so difficult for individuals to change their minds about certain things. And if you read all the studies, and one study was actually conducted jointly by what is his name? Sam Harris, the skeptic. And what these studies show is that once people make a decision to believe a certain way, so I'm going to believe in Trump and I'm going to support him for idea X, Y, and Z, that even if people are shown a mountain of evidence to the contrary, even if they're shown in very clear logical terms why they should not believe in this way, people still will defend their position and become very combative and defensive when presented with new evidence. And I would just encourage everyone, whether you're a Trump supporter or not, or whatever your belief system is and whatever your political disposition, is to make sure that when you're reflecting on your own political views, that you are doing so from the perspective of examining and really self-reflecting on your ideology. Because in my estimation, ideology is the true enemy. The moment that we believe in a political party or a political position or anything for that matter, whether it be political, religious, even our scientific worldviews, and we develop an ideology, we immediately, by definition, now are closing ourselves off to a paradigm or a point of view that is potentially in contradiction of what we believe today. And so when we're looking at things, I encourage everybody to look at the political landscape from an objective standpoint, look at what is happening from a global standpoint, look at the evidence that's out there, and do that instead of looking up the news articles, looking up at the news sources that support your point of view. Try looking from the other side of the fence and look at how the other side is looking at the situation as well.
It's a good exercise.
It's a really good exercise because I think too many times we get trapped in our own ideologies, become very emotional.
Yeah.
Our emotions in these studies, the emotions get linked to our thought process and they become inseparable. And we cease becoming a thinking individual and become a slave to ideology. And I think that's the real evil.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about that, we talk about Kundalini and morality and the clear link between the two. And for those who don't really know that much about Kundalini, the Kundalini mechanism is a biological, psycho-spiritual mechanism in the body that the Emerging Sciences Foundation is dedicated to studying and examining in detail. But, and even in that light, there is this clear connection between Kundalini and morality, right? Kundalini is this mechanism that's designed to raise up human consciousness to superhuman levels, to a state that we call higher consciousness. And there's a lot of different names for higher consciousness. There's samadhi, enlightenment, nirvana, Buddha, Buddha mind, whatever you want to call it.
Christ
consciousness.
Christ consciousness.
And so if you look at the teachings of the religious leaders of the past, or I should say the founders of the major religions, you'll find this common thread that they all prescribe a moral way of living in one form or another. Whether you're talking about the Quran or the Gospels in the New Testament, or you're talking about the Dhammapada or the Vedas, they all prescribe a moral way of living. And the reason for that is because once someone achieves higher consciousness and goes through this accelerated evolutionary process where the end state is higher consciousness, they're able to witness in the laboratory of their own body the functioning and the relationship between moral conduct and an awakened consciousness. And part of the reason for that is because in order to attain higher consciousness, it is such an achievement, such a monumental undertaking.
What did you like calling it? Liken it to an athlete of the soul.
Yeah, I mean, it truly is this enormous effort, right? And so when you look at it from that perspective, they're able to witness the relationship between morality and their own personal evolution. And in that context, it is clear that self-control, a balanced emotional state, a calm mental condition, a focused mind, an open heart,
the golden rule.
Living by the golden rule, having a grounded perspective and a grounded mindset, that is really important in terms of achieving and sustaining higher consciousness. Part of the reason for that is because in the state of higher consciousness, love, intelligence, and expanded awareness dominate the landscape of the inner landscape of the person who achieves this condition, the state of consciousness. And what would in a normal person, an unawakened person, arise perhaps as a negative emotion and maybe an unaligned or immoral thought, in someone who is in higher consciousness, such a thought or emotion would be the equivalent of a mental storm taking place in their interior that could wreak havoc on them. And so it's important to think of it from that perspective, that in order for us to achieve higher dimensions of awareness, we need to perfect ourselves morally. We need to perfect ourselves spiritually. We need to perfect ourselves mentally. We also need to have a certain physical fortitude in order to achieve this state of consciousness, because it is very much a physical process of transformation as we approach higher consciousness.
General regularity.
In terms of
just making sure you sleep enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sleep, critically important. So yeah, just wanted to make that connection to individuals out there.
And I think more like humility, surrender, these other more altruistic tendencies are also highly valuable, and at least those have helped me in my process a lot. At least maybe to open the door. And then now, though, I currently do find myself seeking more inner peace, calming the mind. And maybe, the process is different for everybody. Maybe it's the other way around for someone, and then it's the surrendering, the humility, and then just drop the letting go of the ego is really key, though, throughout every phase, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, and again, not to go back too much, but when we're talking about politics and leaders like Trump,
right,
and their overt immorality, I think it should not be lost on people what the effect of having someone like this in power has for the masses, as opposed to someone who feigns morality and still projects morality to the people, and then on the other hand is doing things on the side for a society as a whole. It might be better for us to have someone who is, let's say, the lesser of two evils, right? As you were saying earlier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things I really liked about the current conversation you had with JJ was talking about how he couldn't really piece together how people like Trump come into power, or how people like even Hitler. Some people have stated that potentially he had an awakened Kundalini.
And that's an important point as well. If you look at people like Adolf Hitler and all the, Stalin or whoever it might be, all the megalomaniacs and leaders that have come to power, Trump, Hillary, whoever it might be, it's important to acknowledge that these individuals came into power because of Kundalini, not because they're in opposition to you. This is an intelligence that is impossible to avoid. It is pervading every aspect of human life. And so when those individuals come into power, sometimes their purpose is just that, to tear down or herald the end of a society or the end of a social order. And that really is their point and their purpose.
I just like the end of a social order.
Yeah. So, and that's, again, looking at it from a larger perspective. When people like this come into power and begin tearing down a society, or through their actions end up eroding society in some way, the idea is that a new society needs to be born to take up the mantle, to move society forward in a new way. And, Europe is a good example, where you see after World War I, World War II, you have the United Nations, you have the European Union, which I won't comment on now, but you have all these different things that came into being to maintain a unity between nations, as opposed to being very fragmented and very much at odds with each other in just about every way prior to World War I. But I think that the better path might be, instead of allowing a society to fall, one thing that might be possible in the future is to study the laws of Kundalini and understand what conditions need to be in place for individuals to evolve in the right direction, how to structure governments in a way to serve the interests of the people, and not just them as individuals, but them as evolving spiritual beings. This is the key.
Yep.
And so part of our research in the Emerging Sciences Foundation is to begin looking at these factors associated with the Kundalini awakening, and looking at what environmental features or what things need to be in a person's life to help them evolve in the appropriate direction.
Right.
And so, to my knowledge, nobody has undertaken any research like this before and gone in this direction. But, for example, time in nature, number of work hours in a day, the political and social orders in which someone lives, their level of income and the level of comfort that they have as an individual. We want to understand what are going to be the healthiest conditions to achieve the evolution of consciousness. And up to this point, I think society has really gone in the direction of, how can we be more materially prosperous?
Yeah.
And everything is based around that. Now, recently you have new things like, I think it was Bangladesh or one of these other Eastern countries who came up with the idea of gross domestic happiness, replacing gross domestic product. Things like this are a step in the right direction in terms of looking at the evolution of our brain and our well-being as individuals and prioritizing that above economic and material gain.
Yeah.
Because ultimately that's what it's going to be about. We may find, for example, that overabundance of wealth, too much comfort, too little that is there to challenge an individual might actually be counterproductive to the evolutionary process.
Trump.
Go ahead, elaborate. What do you mean?
I mean, that sounds like, someone who's, what is he, a millionaire, a billionaire? I'm not even sure at what level he's at now. But just someone who's had it so easy for their whole life, and one could argue that it hasn't been easy for him emotionally or personally, but just his environment has been overabundant, over luxurious, and the mind, at least from my understanding and how it's been for me, there's this need to have to shed things, to let go of things, and sometimes to even struggle personally. And I mean, I don't know his life, but I'm just outwardly saying from just what it seems like, that really, really wealthy people don't have to struggle as much as someone who lives in Compton. And I think that's kind of obvious. And, well, even,
So you're saying that I know you're bringing up the overabundance in his life, right, and the fact that everything's pretty much been handed to him, and even if his initial business dealings were because he had millions of dollars from his father and whatever it might be. So what is the connection there with the Kundalini process and what you see happening politically?
Just the internal struggle, the having to shed the ego at certain layers.
So you're saying he's never had to do that?
I don't know, but I'm assuming.
I think that's a fair assumption if you look at his behavior.
I'm assuming.
So, I mean, I agree with you. You look at that. I mean, I think the real important point behind that is that the overabundance of wealth, the overabundance in anything, really, and not necessarily having to struggle, and not to say he hasn't struggled at all in his life,
right?
But it's a different type of struggle when you have millions and millions and millions versus when you are struggling to survive as an individual, to feed yourself, to clothe yourself, to put a roof over your head. And one of those, the latter, where you're really struggling, forces an individual into a state of humility, forces them to be a little bit more humble with less ego. It forces them to...
They're actually more giving.
And I agree with you. I think people who have less oftentimes give a lot more and more freely than those who have accumulated a lot more and begin hoarding because they begin this process of attaching themselves and their self-identity and their self-worth to the things that they have.
Yeah, maybe because they don't know that there's bigger treasures within them.
Agreed.
Like many of us don't really know that there's bigger treasures within us, you know. I went back to the example of Compton, and just even the people there, you know, it's a different type of struggle, and there's different things going on there. And you would think that, okay, well then if one has to struggle, then why isn't everyone in Compton enlightened or awakened? You know, because now it's environmental, you know, factors playing there. And I think we all definitely have this ability. It's within us all to reach this state. It's our humanly path, right? But the timing, I guess, is key. Sometimes I sway between believing that we can bring a change forward, and then I look at history, and it's so filled with, you know, people not really caring for what goes on. Like, how could the Holocaust go? You know, how could that even have happened?
You're asking how the Holocaust could happen from a moral standpoint, and how could individuals bring themselves to do that?
Everything, like, how could they do that? Why would I don't understand their mental processes, or even racism, you know, something that we've seen so much now thanks to Mr. Trump. It's really hard for me.
I mean, look at the course of evolution from the dinosaurs up until today. 100 million years ago, life was accented by teeth and claws and armored bodies and struggle and fight and warfare. And then towards the end of that span of time, you had the emergence of a new type of animal who was much more loving and caring and nested with each other, nurtured their young, fed them from their own bodies, mammals. And so just when they were starting to come into existence, you have this turning point in the evolution of species of life on the planet, where this cosmic object comes and hits the earth and now cleans the earth of tooth and claw, of dinosaurs and all these ferocious animals that before that time had dominated the earth for 100 million years or so. Mm-hmm. And that same trajectory of evolution is happening today on a different level, on a different scale, with different triggers and different events, but it's still the same type of struggle. If you look at now, you fast forward in time from the extinction of the dinosaurs, and you look at our ancestors, you look at our closest ancestor, the chimpanzee, and you look at how they behave and act, there's cannibalism, there's tribal warfare, there's murders, there's also nurturing of their young, there's also close bonds between members of the same groups of chimpanzees. And now we see ourselves at a point in evolution where we now have, instead of rocks and sticks and strong limbs to harm our enemies, we now are in a point where we have nuclear weapons, we have missiles, we have nerve gases, we have guns and artillery or whatever it might be. But I would say especially nuclear weapons. And so it is the same thrust of evolution to now have us shed the animal within us, to shed the beast within us, and now balance that with the other parts of our being, the more altruistic parts, the parts that can look inside of ourselves and see God immanent there, that can look out into the universe and see ourselves reflected everywhere. this is the course of evolution. This is the target of evolution is now a divine, heavenly, purified, chastened state of consciousness where we now have access to endless worlds of joy inwardly. We have having access to other dimensions of consciousness, perhaps even access to other forms of life as we begin to now unfold this new way of perceiving the universe. And talking about higher consciousness, the perception of the individual in that state is so grand. It is so beyond anything that can be conceived of with the mind or imagined. In order for us to get there, it's going to take a colossal effort on our part, but now requiring the entire whole of humanity to get involved in the process of cleansing ourselves, purifying and upgrading ourselves to the point where now every single person is able to achieve the state of higher consciousness.
How do we cleanse ourselves?
The only way forward that I see, given the state of events today, is for there to occur a scientific validation, and a validation on the part of the common person, that there is a mechanism inside each one of us that is capable of uplifting an individual to higher dimensions of consciousness. That this mechanism is real, and that the reality that it can unfold and bring into the purview of the individual is more real, more solid, more concrete, in some ways more valuable than our limited perception allows us to today. When we look out in the world, we see nature, we see societies, we see a cosmos all governed by laws of the universe. And we see ourselves as a very small, infinitesimal part of this greater whole. In the state of higher consciousness, that entire picture is reversed, and in fact is in some ways annihilated. Because in that state, what we perceive ourselves as is the universe itself. We perceive ourselves as being part of the consciousness, one with the consciousness that is behind the phenomenal universe. And in that state, worlds of consciousness, worlds of light, worlds of joy unfold before the inner eye of the individual in a way that cannot even be imagined. The joy of that state is incomprehensible. And I think that people on the whole need to understand that the reality behind the situation, the objective reality of higher consciousness, and that this state is achievable, and even in small measures in a life. Even if you're an inherently immoral person, that you can achieve some semblance of inner peace, take some small step towards achieving this higher state of consciousness. And by doing that, you will contribute more to this race than if you accumulated $100 trillion and all the technology in the world, and you advance society in all these in different areas of technology, even medicine. That your contribution in attaining higher consciousness will be far more valuable to the species than any other contribution that you can make. And I think this needs to happen on a scientific footing. It needs to happen in a way that is objective and verifiable. Because if it is not objective and verifiable, then what you're going to have is yet another religion. You're going to have yet another ideology. You're going to have yet another perspective of the universe, or the perspective of the world, that is not based on direct observation, but is based on blind belief. And that is where we're at today from a global perspective.
The blind leading the blind.
Is that we have and we have ideology that is ruling over us. And we see that ideology, especially with, the conservative right-wing individuals, becoming more clung on to these old ways, these old systems of humanity, and they'll do anything to defend it. And if the situation ever came down to it, where there was a confrontation between nations, they might, even a nuclear confrontation, they might even become more embattled, more entrenched in their belief systems in a way that would help support such a conflict. And people say, well, that could never happen. People would never act in this way. That is just crazy and ridiculous. And I don't think that the German people in the mid-1930s were crazy. I don't think that they were off their rocker. I don't think that they were mentally insane. I think that what happened was that they became entrenched in ideology. They became embattled and entrenched. And when it came down to now an unfoldment of a global war, they were so entrenched in their ideas and so unable to now review their own ideologies, review their own positions, that they simply sat back and allowed it to happen, despite the destruction, despite the death, despite things like the Holocaust, which people knew were happening.
Yeah.
And so you asked earlier how individuals could allow this to be. You have to be able to put yourselves in the position of somebody who believes so strongly that they're right and is so unwilling to move and change their own perspective and review their own perspective, that they will, in order to maintain their sanity and mental stability, that they will cling on to ideas and allow things to happen that under normal circumstances they would be totally opposed of, including genocide, including murder. And you see this happening in various places, in Rwanda and during the Holocaust, during Stalin's time, in various places, even in China and other places around the world, where ideology became king. And I think what we need to do as a planet is transition from an ideological point of view.
Our foreign policy.
Right, foreign policy. We need to make a transition from an ideological point of view to what I would consider a more scientific, objective view. We need to base our understanding off observation. We need to be able to be willing to look at facts, even if they oppose our worldview. We need to be willing to explore and investigate areas.
So when you say, someone who, instead of making so much money and contributing to medicine, that they would be contributing more if they evolved themselves and ideally reached higher consciousness, is it because in that way they are no longer contributing to this current social order that is very oppressive, and instead are now liberating themselves, and by doing so influence others, or are now themselves a vehicle, a stature type? Do you know? Like,
no.
Just a person to look up to say, hey, they didn't, no one would actually say, hey, you didn't contribute to medicine, but instead it's like.
So I'm not into demonizing societies and saying we live, it's okay to say, yes, we live in some context in an oppressive society. And it depends on what you mean by that. How oppressive, in what way oppressive? Because in society today, there is a lot of good that comes out of it. There is a lot of stability that individuals have. We're not having to fear for our lives at a basic survival level. There's basic sanitation and food that's readily available for individuals. And I'm always of the perspective that instead of tearing down a system, even verbally, the better way is to do as ancient cultures used to do, which is, an example would be in temple building or pyramid building in Mesoamerica. So they would start out by building a temple, and they would have their various rites and rituals in this temple. And once that temple became old enough, or it had served its purpose, then they would build, instead of tearing the temple down, they would build directly on top of it. And they would utilize everything that was good about that original structure and improve on it by building a structure on top of it that did serve their needs. So I don't agree with the perspective of this society is oppressive, let's not feed it at all, let's just tear it down and start with something new. I'm always of the perspective of, let's take what we have, let's learn what we can from it, let's prune away those things that we are no longer necessary, and let us cultivate those things that we need. I think in that approach, you're going to have a much smoother transition, a much healthier transition, than if you were to end up in a situation where there's a nuclear war and now you have to rebuild everything from scratch. I think in almost every case, that's going to be the reality.
Right. And, I somewhat agree to that. Because the list of how we are being oppressed is probably longer than what actually works with this current structure. I can go into it. Our prison system, our educational system, I mean, paying for college or universities is higher than any other place in the world. Just even living conditions, the way we segregate, the way everyone is zoned into different areas, all this racism and the denial of the way this country was first even founded, the natives that lived here, just many, many things with this current structure that just don't sit well with me. And I don't see that they have a lot of benefits, like even homes, how we have to keep remodeling, how we need our latest tile or the nicest counter marble top. These kinds of things are depleting our resources. At what level are we okay with our current structure, our technology, the robots that can carry payloads over to the enemy forces and blow them up in a second? There's so much. I mean, education, that where you go and you drop off your children now and you don't see them because you have to go and spend most of your days working, and you don't see your children. You're not with your family. You're so busy giving your life to this system than having a life. You got fresh food. Yeah, you don't, depends on where you live. You're not going to get shot if you go down the street. But there's a lot of injustice and oppression with what we currently have. And I'm not saying tear it all down, but at what point, what do we want to keep, and what does seriously work for us?
Again, my perspective is this. Yes, there's a lot of oppression. We need to investigate, and we need to find out what are the ideal conditions for people to live.
Agreed.
Without that research, you're shooting blindfolded. You're groping in the dark for solutions. And if you get caught away with the mentality that I live in an oppressive society, I live in an oppressive civilization, and it's tearing down my soul, and I can't live here anymore, that type of thing, you're not doing yourself or anybody else a service at all.
Agreed.
I think that what needs to happen is that the conditions around which we need to live, and the ideal conditions, and investigating those things and allowing those things to inform the way that we live, is where we need to be at the moment in terms of our efforts.
Okay, so here we are, the Emerging Sciences Foundation doing research on these things. At what point, though, will that research actually move super idealist people away from their...
I would say hopefully before there's a nuclear war. Hopefully before there's a nuclear war.
And that's why we're here trying.
If there ever will be. But I think those things are largely beyond our control. I don't think they should be our concern at the moment. I think that the research needs to proceed.
True.
And allow the research to speak for itself, and allow the scientific validation of Kundalini to proceed, and allow that to unfold as well. And that's where you're going to start seeing change. Because we can, like when we first met, and we had this discussion numerous times, we can throw up our arms and kick and scream against society today, and we can become frustrated and become angry and allow those things to in a sense de-evolve us, in a sense move us away from our spiritual target. Because those emotions can be, even themselves, can be converted into compassion. They can be converted into motivation. True. They can be converted into love. And so I think that is the first step. The inner work is the first step. The second step is in engaging and involving ourselves in some effort to further the research. And the reason we even started this podcast was, again, to begin explaining some of these ideas and thoughts to a broader audience, to allow people to understand our perspective, why we would research Kundalini, why Kundalini is so important, what are the current findings, what are we doing today to actually make these changes happen. Because I think too much people look out into the world and they throw up their arms and they say, there's nothing that I can do. This world is too big. There's too much going on. There's too much division in the world, and I have very little say so. And what I'm telling people is that is absolutely not true. That is absolutely a personal delusion that you are feeding into by saying that. Because right now we have set up an experiment that in course of time will allow individuals to awaken Kundalini voluntarily, to help validate everything that we're saying. Again, not to believe in it blindly, but to actually prove it in the eyes of science, to demonstrate it to the world. So you can get involved. You can get involved through the Emerging Sciences Foundation. You can get involved through Brilliano. You can start reading on Kundalini. You can start studying it, which is something that I would recommend to everybody who's listening.
But there's a lot of misinformation out there. So we highly suggest like ICR, the Institute of Consciousness Research. Their website is really great with putting Kundalini into everything that we're talking about, the perspective in this way. Gopi Krishna's work is really amazing, and it actually I want to say that it evolved me, and that it increased my IQ.
All right, well, we're at about 58 minutes.
Oh wow.
So we'll go ahead and end the podcast here. We're going to be trying to do these weekly, and I would also encourage you, whether you're listening on YouTube or through some other medium, please reply back with any comments that you have, any suggestions, and give us your feedback. If there's specific topics that you want to hear more about, just please let us know, and we will try to make those a topic for future broadcasts.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.